get to be the executive director. Yeah.
Maple Producers Association, okay? And we'll let you introduce the other visitors, but why don't we start just with committee members since we got new committee folks? So
Dude.
Representative Nelson, you go first.
Representative Richard Nelson from Orleans One Derby and Ted Young.
Ted Young did receive the Sumner Williams Lifetime Achievement Award from our board this year posthumously, and his family was able to come to our winter conference in December. We miss him. He was on our board for a very long time. Yep. Yep. And I'm in a neighboring district of yours. I'm in Lindenville.
I represent Jed Lipsky, the Wild Wine Stowe. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm Leland Morgan. I represent Grand Isle County and Westmont.
Okay. Yep.
David Durfee from Shaftesbury and represents Sunderland and Glastonbury. And I think a few years back, I counted 8 producers in Shaftesbury. I don't know if they're all still doing it.
It's a very popular place. Yeah. And when you look at the Maple Open House weekend map for that area, it's always very easy for me to send you an email to recommend where you should go. The challenge is in limiting it to not suggest you go everywhere. Yeah.
Hi, I'm John O'Brien, Royal Open Tunbridge.
And Michelle Boslin, Westminster, Rockingham, and Brookline.
Nice. Thank you.
And Sidonia is the
Rocking out.
committee assistant.
Rocking out just like last year, right?
Representative Supernut will had to step out for a minute. Over to you.
Last year as well. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. Was going to reach out to Sidonia and she reached out to me before I could reach out to her. So it was perfect timing. Nice job. We love to come back and talk to you. I offered some written testimony. I just wanted to sort of illustrate it, bring it to life, tell our story beyond those pages. And because you have some newer members, just go through what it is we do as an association before we talk about the state of the maple industry. So we've been around as an association in some iteration since 1893. And some of that was sort of separate groups looking at different things, whether it was the Maple Promotions Board, the industry group, the producers group. We're all under one tent now and have been that way for probably over a decade. And really just working to bring more people into the tent. We have upwards of 700-800 members. Estimates are at about 3,000, 3,500 for the number of producers in the state. We have educated guesses rather than hard data on those sorts of things. But I like to think of us as the public radio of producer associations in the sense that we are here to represent all of the sugar makers, benefit all of the sugar makers, advocate for all of the sugar makers in the state, whether they have a membership in the association or not. It just makes sense for us to do that. So we try to reach as many folks as we can. And we look at 4 program areas. So marketing, advocacy, partnerships, and education and research. And really try to act as the face for consumers of Vermont maple, unless they have a favorite producer who has connected with them in a really great way through open house weekend or some other way. And a funnel for sugar makers. There's a lot of players on the maple stage across Canada and the maple producing states in the US. So really making sure that we pay attention to everything so sugar makers don't have to and sit at tables and have conversations like these to represent sugar makers so they can be out in the woods tapping their trees. For marketing, we've had lots of conversations at this table about the Big E. We have 2 cornerstone programs for consumer marketing. One is the Eastern States Exposition. Not sure if you're all aware, you will be soon. If you are not, you, like I, own a building in the state of Massachusetts on the grounds of the Eastern States Exposition. Soon it will be a little more expensive building. There's a lot of deferred maintenance. The association has had a booth there since prior to 1964, but that's about the extent of the paperwork I can find. The building has been there since 1929. So that deferred maintenance will probably come to an end as we get closer to that 100th anniversary because everybody wants it to look tip top. Ticket sales last year at the Big E over the 17-day fair were a record high of about 1.7 million people coming through. A lot of those people come through the Avenue of the States, where the Vermont building is. And a lot of those people come through our building. A lot of folks will come through saying that they used to come with their grandparents and now they're bringing their kids. Folks have a lot of questions. They'll look at maple cream, for example, and ask if it's something they should put on their face. And the answer is sure. It wants to, but I think that leads you in a different direction from what we are intending to have a conversation about. Even with the level of folks that come through that building, we have time to have one-on-one conversations with consumers about how to use maple, to talk about producers, to say, hey, that volunteer over there is the one who made the Golden Delicate syrup that we're selling here. So we bought all of the 3 grades of syrup that we brought with us this year from different producers from around the state as a great example. And we put them in the association containers because they have our website and our information in them. We noticed that a lot of folks, when we offer them a sample of golden, amber, and dark, a lot of them actually prefer the dark. But the further away you get from Vermont, the less likely it is that you're going to be able to buy that on a shelf anywhere. So most people are used to trying the amber, and they're super curious. It's not a huge moneymaker for us. This year was a banner year. There wasn't a ton of rain. We sold about $230,000 worth of product, which sounds like a lot until you realize we are running a booth that is open for 11 hours a day in West Springfield, Massachusetts for 17 consecutive days with a couple on either end for setup and cleanup. So this year, even with banner sales, we made about $56,000 in net profit, and we sent a check for half of that to the state for commissions. So we brought home about as much money as we sent to the state. We are in the process of reapplying for our booth for the next 3-year contract, and our commission will go from 12% to 15%. And so I was looking for ways to bring some of that money back into the association, because all it does is fuel the rest of the work that we do throughout the year.
The commission is based off the gross.
Gross sales, yeah. So as our margin gets slimmer because prices go up and there's a diminishing returns of raising prices more than we already have, we'll just get the squeeze. But that's a long-term conversation. It is a fundraiser for us, but it really is consumer marketing, and it is hard to reach that many people in person at any other event that we have the capacity to go to. So it still continues to make sense for us to do that in terms of how we benefit our producers. Maple Open House Weekend, of course, is the one that's coming up in March on the 22nd and the 23rd. Last year, we had 100 locations registered. And we do an awful lot of advertising inside and outside of the state in different population areas closer to Connecticut and New York and Massachusetts that draw people in. And it is just a great way for sugar makers to show their passion and tell their stories. And from a local food perspective, that's what brings people in, and that's what gets people interested. It's our aspirational thoughts about where our food comes from, the fact that it's a single ingredient sweetener, and the fact that sugar makers are really good storytellers. And Maple Open House Weekend just marries all of those things together. Last year, I sent committee members some suggestions about, hey, here's the Maple map. Here's what's open in your area. We would love for you to go meet the sugar makers in your district. And I'll do the same thing again this year in the hopes that you'll get out and find some sugar houses. And I guess you can just hang out with yourself. And your own consumers. Yeah, exactly. So, hey, how's it going? In terms of the partnerships segment of our work, there are, just like there are a lot of people in the agricultural space, there are a lot of people in the maple space into Canada and across the US. And we are building relationships and have been in the 5 years that I've been with the association. We've been spending those 5 years just slowly planting seeds and building relationships. It's incredibly important to what we do. And it's part of that funnel of how we share information and make sure, like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We're special, but we don't need to be so special that we reinvent every wheel. We're curious and there's a lot to learn. So whether it's currently we're partnering on a grant that includes, comes from Forest Parks and Rec, but it includes Tony D'Amato at UVM. Mark has been on some of those calls. It's Audubon, it's NOFA. So that's been wonderful. We partner with NOFA and Vermont Organic Farmers in a grant through Pennsylvania Organics, which is a USDA transition to organic partnership program, which is about mentorship for people who are what I call organic curious. If you're organic curious and you want to know more about organic practices and what that application and process looks like, then we can hook you up with a mentor who has a group of mentees, and the mentor actually gets paid through that program to be a mentor. So that's been successful and helps answer a lot of questions. This morning, we had a call with a representative from the Equipment Manufacturers Association, who he represents LaPierre, but there are 4 really large equipment manufacturers. Most of them are housed in Canada, but they all have shops and storefronts in Franklin County, and then have dealers around the state. And so to be able to have a point of contact for our association to ask a food safety equipment related question, we need to have a partnership and know who people are. We have 2 large trade association groups in North America. So the North American Maple Syrup Council and the International Maple Syrup Institute. We belong to both of those. IMSI also has individual members. So, Emma and her family, individual members, but also members through the association. IMSI in particular, extremely strategic thinking on both sides of the border in terms of what happens in the maple space. So we can participate on calls about marketing and what the U.S. is going to do more collaboratively in terms of maple syrup marketing. And we can talk about government affairs. What are the federal changes in the U.S. looking towards? And, there are definitely some federal changes happening in Canada as well.
Representative O'Brien, you had a question?
Just a couple of small things.
Yeah.
What were the 4 big sugar producer?
LaPierre, CDL, Dominion Graham, and I still call them H2O/Leader. They were purchased by H2O, but some of them have Leader emails and some of them H2O. So it feels like they haven't quite finished that up yet.
And I was wondering, just at the Big E, is Vermont maple the only maple there? I wondered if other Northeast states or Canada.
They do. So on the Avenue of the States, some of the other state buildings do have maple in them. I'm biased, but their booths are, I think, less dynamic. They're smaller than ours. And the breadth of products we offer. So this year we brought in a couple of new products. Admittedly, one is made in Canada, but they're the maple cream cookies that everyone loves, right? So open a box of those and it's a single serving size. So we brought those, people liked them. We have all the pure maple products, of course. And we brought some maple snack mix from Two Brothers Maple in Richford that when I lived up in the northern part of Vermont, became acquainted with. And maybe the next time we come to this committee, I will bring some. You will understand my passion for this. Became everybody else's passion as well. But their booths are smaller and seem to be less focused on education. People will come to our booth and say, well, I just went to the Massachusetts building. And I said, great. Which grade of syrup did you try that you really liked? There are different grades. Okay, well, we can have this conversation in Vermont. We're ready for you. Let's stand over here. We'll pour it out.
I was at the Big E and a slow day, maybe a Wednesday, and went through all 6 of the buildings in the Avenue of the States. And clearly, and I'm not biased, the Vermont building was the best of all 6.
I would agree.
And largely, I would say because of the maple.
Oh, thank you. We do take up a lot of floor space, and a lot of people who came before me did a really good job of creating a booth that feels authentic. You walk through the Connecticut building and it feels like you're at a trade show or in the airport. It's pretty homogenous. And you walk through the Vermont building and the Agency of Ag staff, who are building managers, have done a really good job curating vendors and offering them spaces that just feel like a visit to Vermont.
Thank you, Chairman Murphy. Learned this morning, have it verified, but the administration may be putting tariffs on northern and southern.
Yep.
And with dairy, our largest export is to the south. What kind of ramifications does this have for Maple?
Yeah.
Because our equipment, a lot of it comes from the north
Yep.
and, big deal.
It's a great question,
It-
and
it's not kind to agriculture.
it's not kind to a lot of things, for sure. And when we talk about government affairs and changes at the federal level, there are a few areas that give us some pause and keep me up at night from time to time. And the tariffs are certainly one of those. The 25% tariffs on Canadian imports, boy, when I say that all 4 large equipment manufacturers make their equipment in Canada, like think about, there's already a high cost of capital. You take aside the land issue and how expensive land is in Vermont, the high cost of capital to get into Maple in a way that's large scale enough that you might be able to quit your day job and buy yourself and your family some health benefits. And if we're going to tack 25% tariffs on top of those, I can't even begin to understand how that's going to affect the cost of equipment. The other piece of that is anything that's ancillary, whether it's tubing or spouts or smaller pieces of equipment, or syrup. So Canada sells to 68 or 69 different countries outside of their own. And the country that they sell the most amount of syrup to is Vermont, not surprisingly. So Vermont could certainly grow and grow and grow in market share and push Canada to send some of that syrup to some of the other countries they send it to. But a tariff on that syrup coming into the United States, I'm sure Emma has some good feedback on that as well. Maple Grove and St. Johnsbury, a lot of the syrup that they use in their products is Canadian syrup. They bring it down by the tractor trailer load. Vermont doesn't have enough we create half of the US crop. And last year, the USDA statistics put it at just over 3 million gallons. That's a great number. That's not enough to feed the rest of the United States with maple syrup, which is why it gets blended. And the way that those contracts work for larger packers are lost and won by pennies. And so anything that creates a market pressure on some of those contracts means that that shelf space might go to something else besides pure maple syrup. And that market desire across the country benefits Vermont sugar makers in a number of different ways. Canada spends $10 million a year on marketing maple syrup. We ride their coattails, and we have to be okay with that because, the United States doesn't have enough collective money to spend on that. We also ride the coattails of folks like Runamuck and Butternut and Coombs Family Farm, because they're the larger bulk packers and suppliers of Target and Whole Foods and Costco. So super concerning, but also immigration, right? Like our agriculture system in the United States runs on immigration, legal, illegal, or otherwise. And we have sugar makers in the state who use visaed workers. That conversation still seems to be ongoing. But that is a food security, food availability issue in the United States in terms of the kinds of conversations that we anticipate, coming out of the federal transition.
Back to the equipment and
Yeah.
and the 4 manufacturers, they're Canadian businesses. They have storefronts, but they don't do any manufacturing in the States.
I'm not aware at all, Mark, are you?
They do some. It's not the bulk of the manufacturing. I know Leader had a tubing line. I believe they still operate. So some of the stuff. They do welding manufacturing. There's even smaller companies, smaller than the big 4 that do injection molding for fittings and that sort of thing. But Allison's absolutely right. The vast majority of the material used to make syrup, either stainless steel evaporators and tanks or plastic fittings.
It's a big
Most of
deal.
them come from Canada.
And arrows come out.
So it would be disruptive. The other, the third area that causes concern is what federal agencies are going to look like in a few years, right? So the USDA and the FDA, if they have less teeth or regulatory oversight than they do now, conversations about adulteration that we haven't had as a maple industry in a really long time may come back. I've heard Mark say on more than one occasion that way back when Chicago used to make more maple syrup than Vermont did, and that's because, of course, it wasn't maple syrup. And that issue in the US for the most part is a non-issue now. But in terms of the conversations we've already had with the FDA about added sugars and how single source or single ingredient sweeteners like maple have come to some understanding of what that actually means for our nutrition label when we don't add sugar, we're just selling product that is sugar. Are those going to go away? Are those agreements going to change? Are we going to have issues with folks making and labeling products that are way cheaper to make than maple syrup? Label them as maple syrup and have them not be maple syrup to carve out some market share in those areas. I think that's of concern. And then I think even more recently, and it's expected with new federal changes, but the appointments that USDA makes, especially in Vermont, to rural development and the farm service agencies. So John Roberts and Sarah Waring already gone as leaders. Personally, the association found them incredibly communicative, anticipatory in terms of the sorts of weather events or other issues that are going on in the state or grants that might be available to reach out and talk about those things. And that has a trickle-down effect on the entire staff that are in those agencies. It sounds like Sarah's already gotten another job and potentially in a space that we might be able to partner with. But it leaves a huge knowledge gap for two really important roles in the state. They were very effective at what they did and were curious who they'll be replacing.
They'll be replaced presumably by new appointees.
That's the idea, and I think it would depend on how long that's actually going to take. And
This is the Farm Service Agency.
the Farm Service Agency and Rural Development.
Rural Development.
Yeah, both USDA.
John was with us.
John was FSA,
Yeah.
and Sarah, who's local to you all here, Sarah was Rural Development. Yep, both super effective. So yeah, we have some concerns there. Increased cost of production is already an issue for a lot of sugar makers. We hear anecdotally. So the pinch point that you hear from all Vermonters, things are getting more expensive and I'm not making more money, can be true of sugar makers as well. Things are getting more expensive and the cost, the retail price point or the bulk price point for syrup isn't going up appreciably to make up that difference. And so if you layer a 25% tariff on top of that, like there might be some short-term benefit to Vermont sugar makers if Canadian syrup is more expensive coming across the border. We still have a limited supply. You know, if Canada's making 73% of the world's supply of syrup, we're a much smaller portion of that. Still special, but much smaller portion. And so how we figure that out to help sugar makers so they're not doing the same thing, increasing production and making the same or less money every year is important. And then, you know, I took a paragraph for it here, but climate change, and Mark does a great job illustrating this as well. But we've compressed the season. Mother Nature has. We've helped her clearly compress the season over the years, and it's already such a short season. We used to have our winter conference in January. We had, well, it used to be statewide that there were 12, and people would go to each county that actually had active sugar makers and an active association. Whittled that down to 2 weekends. So one in Hyde Park and one in Brattleboro. Addison County always did their own. And those were in January. Those were in consecutive weekends in January. And our winter conference now is in the middle of December. Because if we try to host a larger conference in January, the vast majority of sugar makers are out in the woods then. That's a product of climate change. But climate change has so many other effects on the forest, whether it's the soil health, the layer on the forest floor, the ability for maple trees to be successful, what that means for invasive plants. Yep, high wind events, storms. We've had plenty of those in recent years, flooding. You know, I like to listen to Mark say that the sugar maple is a Goldilocks tree and doesn't like necessarily to have its feet wet. Like it likes certain conditions, and Vermont doesn't always serve up those certain conditions. Red maple's a little more resilient. Some of the studies out of Proctor and Cornell have shown. So folks are certainly tapping those as well. But over the long haul, what folks have mitigated climate change with is technology and innovation. And so folks who have started using reverse osmosis to concentrate their sap, vacuum systems, different kinds of taps, meters that will show them how their vacuum system is doing. So they don't have to walk the entire woods. They can just look at the little red dots on their map and figure out where they need to focus their energy. Over the past 10, 15 years, folks who have adopted those have been able to mitigate some of what climate change has offered up. Not the high wind events, of course, but the shrinking or the condensing of the season. Climate change is going to continue, and innovation, as I understand it, through equipment manufacturers and technology is not going to continue at the same trajectory that it has for the past 10 or 15 years. And so then we'll be turning to research on tapping practices and forest health management practices that look beyond equipment and technology innovation. And funding those is going to be just as important. And some of that funding comes from the Farm Bill. And in the federal government, we've just been kicking that can down the road by extending it. We don't have a fully approved long-term Farm Bill at this point, and that might be another issue at that level. The United States has some direct money from the USDA, ACER Access and Development Program that offers millions of dollars a year for maple funding in different areas of the country. And that research is going to be more important than ever. And I have some concerns about what's going to get cut at the federal level and where that money's going to land. But yeah, we're not going to be able to only use technology to make this a sustainable practice.
Yeah, Allison, thank you. And I don't know if this is Mark or you, but you talked about the condensing of the productive season and climate. And, I'm also concerned about tree health.
Yeah.
For a whole variety of reasons. But what I'm curious about, the producers in our community, summertime, they've been boiling sap in December or January. And so it may be more sporadic instead of a 3-week crazy push.
I wish you had a whiteboard, because Mark does a really good a whiteboard analysis of sap flow. Yeah.
So despite the 2 previous on very little freezing of winter, which affected the forest harvesting sector, was very destructive.
Yeah.
Whereas this year we've got cold in December, and with the exception of 2 or 3 days, it's remained classic, not ferociously cold, but cold, the very cold winter. Do you think that how is that going to affect, you reckon, this seed production?
Well, and we used to have conversations, right? When I was younger, it felt like there were less nuanced conversations, and maybe that's because I was younger, about the sugaring season. Like you used to be able to say, like, it was a great season, or it was not a great season, or it was a better than average. They like to talk in averages, but the conversation in the last couple of years has really gotten to if your sugar bush was sloped to help drain the water, and it was, facing a certain direction, and it was in the valley, and it was in a warmer area, then this year it did okay. And if it wasn't those things, then yeah, it's the microclimates. And it is amazing to me in a state as small as Vermont that we have so many different areas at play, and it depends on where your sugar bush is, whether you're going to have a good year or a bad year. And so, last year it was good for some and bad for others, and the roles were reversed the year before. Same weather.
That never flowed when it was bonanza days for other.
Or when you felt like it was gonna be a bonanza day, but that snowpack was still around the base of your tree. And so the sap wasn't gonna let loose the way you expected, and then it was cold enough for the whole winter that just never happened. You know,
Service used across the state is also not uniform.
Yeah.
We have an area that's clustered in certain parts. So if the weather is favorable, generally favorable for sap flow, you'll see large crop in those areas, and the reverse is also true. If Franklin County was a state instead of a county, it would be the second largest producing state in the country. It's not at all even across. And as Allison said, last year, there was a warm up in mid-March. It happened to not get too warm in the areas where the bulk of production is made. And they were able to continue on when the weather went back to more seasonal temperatures. If you had a warmer bush last year, you saw the effects of that warmth impacting tappable productivity, and they never really recovered. And we've had quite a bit of oscillation in the last 5 years. The impact on the crop, however, really depends on where that unique weather was in terms of where the production is on the state.
And there's a compounding factor here, which is labor. With demographic shifts, one of the challenges is having adequate labor to tap in time for the beginning of the season, or even the typical beginning of the season, and that is changing the patterns of when people are getting out to the woods to start tapping, which is then changing the timing of when people begin collecting sap. And the technologies are such that supports that more today than it ever happens. But that is another compounding factor in terms of how sugarmint season's shifting.
Representative O'Brien?
Is Vermont at an all-time high of number of taps?
I would say no, because historically, the production, we're actually close to a historic high for production. But you have to think about the vast majority of the history of maple production. It looked a lot like this picture
Right, yeah.
here. You had, I mean, how many buckets can realistically one small farm family put out every year? On average, it was in the hundreds. You had thousand top operations and larger when you had buckets, but it was less common. And we've seen over the last 100 years this big shift on lots of parts of agriculture, but maple is really no different. A huge drop in the number of farms and a concentration, the number and higher average tap count because of the labor saving represented by tubing and vacuum. So number of taps, I would say no. But back then it was all gravity sap collection. You drill a hole and you hope for the best. Technology can't overcome all the threats from climate change, but it can set a bit of a floor under the right conditions so that you know you're going to get a certain amount. It can't handle the really anomalous high temperature events. That's the biggest threat right now for maple. But in those years where it gets warm and doesn't freeze, but doesn't get catastrophically warm, vacuum producers will continue to see sap flow. Gravity producers like those in the picture, you wouldn't see sap again until it froze and the tree could recharge the sap.
Mark, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say, to make sure that we hear from you, and Emma, if you wanted to introduce yourself.
Sure,
or
yeah.
either, yeah.
Thanks. My name is Mark Isselhart. I'm the maple specialist and I lead the Extension Maple program for the University of Vermont. Pleasure to be in front of the committee again. I am beholden to make sure that I identify that I'm not here to advocate for anything. I'm really here just as an educator and a researcher through the university, but it's definitely important for me to share that. I've been involved in maple for a long time. I was a forestry undergrad student, and that's really when I first, other than making some really bad backyard syrup when I was young, that was the first time I really got a taste of what maple and maple research was all about. Had some wonderful mentors to help me along the way. But during that sort of 25, roughly, it's hard to say, but a 25-year period, we've seen a 5x growth in maple production in Vermont. And for something that's so visible and such an incredible part of the culture of Vermont, it's hard to really wrap your mind around that amount of growth. And that growth hasn't come equally across all sized operations, hasn't grown equally across the state geographically. We've seen a mix of new operations starting from essentially nothing going in at a very large scale. And we're seeing multi-generational operations that were already established getting much larger. And again, it's hard to disentangle the history of maple from where we're at now. Not unlike other areas of agriculture, our estimates are about 80% of the crop are produced by about 20% of the producers. And that's changed quite a bit from where maple was a little bit more balanced across all size classes. What that means is that you have 20% of the crop is made by 80% of the producers, which you're much more likely to have a connection to a relatively small operation, someone down the road, and that sort of thing. But the crop itself is made by relatively large operations. The USDA have chosen to set up different size classes in their annual reporting. The largest they report is 20,000 taps and larger. Vermont has over 90 of those, by far the most of any state. And it is a product that has all sorts of variables that are unable to be predicted, not unlike other parts of agriculture. The difference is that period of critical sap flow is condensed into a very short period of time. And Allison's right, the season appears to be shifting earlier, it's compressing. And yet during that same period, we're seeing yields go up. And so the technology is one of the most likely factors to explain that, but there is a limit. We know we haven't reached the limit for what a particular tap hole could produce. We know experimentally we can exceed what the average is now, but there is a limit. And the work that I do, it looks at three big areas. It's sugar bush health management, sustaining high yields, sustainable yields of sap and syrup. So it's not just how much can I get out, but is that sustainable from the tree's perspective year after year? And then the last is sort of quality. I also want to make it clear that while I'm based at the Proctor Maple Research Center, that's a separate entity. It's part of the plant biology department. Over the last year, I've hired a new director there. Tim Rademacher is the new director, and I'm sure he would be happy to share his expertise as well. But we have a good partnership between Extension and the Proctor Center, and we collaborate on research and outreach and other areas. We do our own thing. The issue of climate change, we're talking about a perennial plant that lives for 200 to 300 years. And it's not something that we put out seeds each year and harvest the result of that. So the management is going to be different than it would be for other crops. And that variability of the weather, we say the season might be 4 to 6 or 8 weeks long, but it's made up of far fewer number of individual sap flow events during that season. Missing 1 or 2 can make a big difference in terms of the overall target that the producer had. We've never been able to predict when the season is. There've definitely been the common, well, it's around town meeting day or so, but that has almost more to do with the size of your operation with an impact of climate than it does anything else. So if you have 100,000 taps, the ideal weather may be showing up in mid-February, but as Emma said, the number one issue I hear from producers is I can't find anyone to do this work other than the cost of production going up. But you have to start in December if you have that many taps in order to get them ready for when the season really starts.
Can't put them all in the day before.
Not yet anyway.
Yeah, back. Not quite as far Stone Age as Jed is, but maybe they are just ahead of them. You never tapped until just before the run because they said you didn't want to make a dry hole.
Mm-hmm.
So they wait and tap. And I notice now a lot of people back home are tapping every warm day they have.
Yep.
There's probably people out drilling today because it's warming up. Tomorrow they won't drill because the trees will be too cold. But the technology that you've all created through Procter Extension has just been really changing the maple industry hugely. And, you know, and I'm from Derby, so we have a farm in Canaan. So I drive 114 and I go by Sweet Tree. And then there's another big outfit now closer to Norton, and they have 3 gigantic silos out there now. And I heard they're Canadians that are actually down here doing it in Vermont.
Yeah, the technology really has changed quite a bit. To say I use tubing and vacuum isn't really enough. I mean, we used to, when I started, it was a pump that we used for milking.
Yep.
You could turn it on twice a day, maybe 3 times a day if you milk 3 times a day, but it couldn't handle running 24/7. Now sugar makers are using pumps that are more akin to what you'd see in a hospital or a factory where they're designed to run all the time.
Or a rotary milking parlor.
And so the idea that you almost have to say it's even more fine than just vacuum or not vacuum, because it's the management of that technology that makes a difference. And yet at the other end of the spectrum, the quality needs to be the same. It doesn't matter if you have a handful of buckets and are doing it as a lifestyle hobby with a family, or a severely leveraged large operation that is trying to squeeze out as much as they can. The regulations that Agency of Ag has put forward require that the syrup reaching the customer have the same quality based on color, clarity, density, and flavor. And we know that not every drop of syrup in the marketplace meets that. And so it's really important. You can build an industry around high production, but if the quality isn't there, consumers are going to have a bad experience, or they're just going to choose something that's less expensive to do that sweetening, unless they have a really rich cultural connection to the product. So some of the research we've done is looked at syrup in the retail marketplace and finding and quantifying where syrup doesn't measure up, and then trying to communicate with producers and whoever the results, but also what are some ways that could explain why this is the case. Some of it is technological. You know, syrup darkening is the number one issue as far as issues with grade. Probably doesn't have a huge impact on the average consumer, but if syrup is too dark for the grade, technically it is out of a spec, and you could over time see a consumer feeling like they don't know what they're going to get if every time they buy one, they think they're getting this, they get something else.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Just to clarify your role, you mentioned that you're based in Proctor, but that you don't work for the research center, you work for the extension.
Correct.
And does your work then involve travel around the state, working directly with producers?
It does. Yeah. I engage with producers across the state, both through a partnership where we have a lot of educational opportunities, technical trainings. The information that we generate and share goes beyond Vermont as well. The average consumer doesn't, unfortunately, a lot of people spend a lot of money to try to make a brand, but the average consumer doesn't recognize a whole lot of brand differentiation. And so if they have a bad experience with the quality of syrup, for example, they're going to apply that judgment across all brands or types of syrup. So I definitely reach out internationally as well.
Thank you, Chairman. It's same with milk. Milk doesn't have a brand. Is maple syrup, we've been hearing a lot about the 30%, feeding the region, 30% of our food. Maple must be counted in that. Absolutely. I would think so. All right, the advent of internet sales have really gonna change. Like, we have Jed's Maple back home.
Yep.
And Steve, left an engineering job and is making a living. Tapping 7,000 trees, and I think he buys some bulb, but
It's also because of all those value-added products. Yeah.
The way maple has changed, not only on the scale of production, but also how it's marketed. So you maybe go back 30 years, we were closer to 50-50 where 50% of the crop was sold in bulk in a barrel to one of the businesses that blends, and the other would be a wholesaler or direct to consumer. And now we're at about 85% bulk, maybe in some cases close to 90%. And that's happened during that same period of rapid expansion as the new businesses. Although you can market directly to the consumer, it takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and there's a lot of other products to capture people's attention. And so that growth has really been in the bulk market.
Can I add on to just the marketing side? So by way of super brief introduction, because I'm looking at.
Do you want to come on up to the?
Sorry. My name is Emma Marvin. I'm with Butternut Mountain Farm. For those of you who don't know, Butternut Mountain Farm, we're a family-owned maple company based in Morrisville. We work with several hundred producers across the state of Vermont and across the maple producing region. We not only package and distribute maple syrup, we also have our own sugaring operation with about 30,000 taps. But the core of what we do is that packaging and distribution. And to the question around sort of market and that piece of the conversation, I did want to chime in and offer two thoughts. One, I think one of the things that's really important for us to recognize is that while brands may not be overly prominent within maple, one of the brands that is very prominent within maple is the Vermont Maple brand. And one of the reasons it's really important for us to be here in front of you today is that Butternut Mountain Farm doesn't own that brand. You don't own that brand, but we all derive value from the Vermont Maple brand, and it is real. And the regulations that are in place in this state, in combination with passion, the breadth and depth of production that happen are what are the underpinnings of that. And it is something that is meaningful and worth stewarding, and not something that can be stewarded alone on an individual level or even just within the Sugar Makers Association. So I'm very appreciative of the time that we have with you to really emphasize the role that the state does have in helping sugar makers here in Vermont protect that brand. In terms of the market and how it has changed over the years, so my role for almost 20 years at Butternut Mountain Farm has really been focused on marketing and sales. And I will tell you, within the last few years, one of the things I have really noticed is a change in the conversations I have with people every day. I now will pick up the phone with a phone call from a friend and they'll say, "Hey, Emma, guess what I did this morning? Put maple syrup in my coffee." And 10 years ago, people would have looked at me when I was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about putting maple syrup in your coffee?" Like I was crazy. Why would you do that? Syrup in your coffee? And now people are wearing that like a badge of pride. How consumers are thinking about maple is changing, and it is showing up in a way in terms of the frequency of purchase, the number of households that are purchasing maple syrup. That's increasing. Small amounts, 1%, 2%, but that is very meaningful. And we're seeing increased sales, both volume and dollars, across categories, mainline grocery, mass market, for maple compared to other syrups out there, when actually the overall syrup category is seeing some decline in market share, we are seeing growth. So a really exciting story in place for maple to be coming out of the pandemic. And we do look very different than, say, the 1990s, 1970s, even further back in terms of how maple is making it to market. Maple is now widely available across the country. I am surprised when I go into a store and it's not on the shelf. That wasn't true 25 years ago, certainly wasn't true 40 years ago. And that is a tremendous amount of opportunity and impact here in the Northern Forest in terms of ability to make a living and a life off the land, making an agricultural product.
Representative Lipscomb.
Yeah, Emma, thank you, welcome. My question is, I heard a word maybe 30 minutes ago called blended, in whiskey or whatever.
Sure.
Not a single barrel. But we're prideful, and thank you for representing the Vermont brand as being so meaningful. But we know that Canada is the largest national producer of maple syrup. But is there any Vermont maple syrup being sold and branded as Vermont maple syrup that contains imported syrup?
Not at Butternut Mountain Farm, and not that I am aware of. So I think that is one of the pieces that is so important.
Keeping the Vermont brand pure.
Yeah, so for Butternut Mountain Farm, you might find our product in the local Max Market, at Stowe Mercantile. You might find it at Whole Foods, Walmart, and Wegmans. That's our Butternut Mountain Farm branded product. The majority of syrup that we package and distribute from Butternut Mountain Farm doesn't carry the Butternut Mountain Farm name on it. It carries the name of the retailer. And so to the extent we have relationships outside of Vermont, it's about making sure that those markets that we are creating for the product that we purchase from producers exist year in and year out, no matter what the crop is like here in Vermont, because we have diversified supply. So it is those kinds of retailers that Allison was highlighting, where you go into Hannaford's and it's the Hannaford brand, or you go into Price Chopper and it's the Price Chopper brand, or you go into Costco and it's the Kirkland brand. That is actually the majority of our retail packaging business, is in the space where it is the customer's own brand product on shelf. Yeah.
Representative Burt?
I was just gonna say, Eva, your company is it the largest packaging company in the US of maple syrup?
I honestly don't know the answer to that.
No.
We have a
Darn
peer,
close.
so across the maple industry, we have a peer group of probably 5 or 6 that are of similar size and scale.
And your father's
It-
business.
Yeah, the history of Butternut Mountain Farm, we started in 1972 on the slopes of Butternut Mountain in Johnson, diversified hill farm, but not sort of the typical diversified hill farm, in that no animal agriculture, timber stand improvement, maple sugaring, Christmas trees. The ebbs and flows of the seasons in the 80s caused my dad to have to really think about what the business model was going to look like, and whether we were going to fire some customers because we didn't have adequate supply, or whether we were going to think differently about how we supplied our customers. And the story and me sitting here today gives you the answer to what that decision looked like.
But your dad also helped start Procter Maple Research Center as
So-
well.
So my family's history in maple goes back before the creation of Butternut Mountain Farm. My grandfather was a botanist for the University of Vermont, and was one of the founders of the Procter Maple Research Center. And he spent his career studying sap flow dynamics in maple.
Maple supports maple, I think.
So I take it that's maple earrings.
I'm sorry to say this is not maple. I
Which version?
That's a good question. I didn't make them. I don't know. I'm at this
Yeah.
stage. Boxing.
One thing that didn't come up that I would love to just throw out there is how maple is made has changed a lot. We're holding the line on quality, or trying to, but the way the forest is managed is getting some new eyes and new perspectives. And I hate to keep picking on this picture, but the model of relatively few large diameter, widely spaced trees with deep flow crowns is no longer the ideal when you think about a resilient forest that has to deal with an unknown future, about unpredictable weather events and invasive insects and plants. And so we're very lucky to be an extension. We have Ali Pasiva, be the extension forester. Tony D'Amato, who's chairing the forestry department, is really very, very good. And there's this growing understanding that a more diverse forest, both in species, but also in structure, in age and structure, it's not going to guarantee, just like a vacuum pump isn't going to guarantee you don't have a bust a year because it gets too hot, but it gives the forest a chance to be resilient in the face of dynamic storm events and that sort of thing. So I think, the picture And some of the communication I do with producers is that the image of an ideal sugar bush may look different. It may even look messy to a lot of folks. But the way we harvest sap has changed, and there's no reason to believe that the way we manage forests can also change as well. But it involves some education. May not be able to walk in every direction freely the way that you would when you needed to do that with buckets. Maybe there's going to be more carbon that's sitting there on the forest floor, slowly turning over. But I think the imagery around what an ideal sugar bush is poised for a change as well. What a healthy forest looks like may not look like a understory with nothing but leaves.
We're gonna take one more question, because we're running over, and then Sidonia needs to head out. So we will continue meeting, but we will have to manage technology. I'm saying that here so that we're all in this together. Representative O'Brien.
Mark, that just reminded me, with the sort of pressures on other trees like emerald ash borer and now beech having beech leaf and beech bark, is there research being done on like what happens if the makeup of our forest really changes here? I mean, like, do maples have relationships with other trees so that they're not the only tree left in the forest?
Absolutely. I mean, there's work being done, not specifically focused on the impact of this unique product, but just sort of forest health in general. Absolutely. Work being done at UVM, regionally, internationally. It's very, there's an assemblage of species that we have in our northern forest that is being reassembled in a way, both through forces that are beyond our control and then some things that we do on our own, to change it. And so the issue becomes, not unlike maple research, it's a very hard thing to study because you're talking, it's not an annual plant. We can throw out seeds, take down data, what happened this year, do it again, do it 3 years to be sure, and then you can write it up. Talking about very, very long-term research, which generally does not attract a rich amount of funding to follow. But it's a great question. There's best guesses and there's modeling, but the further you go in the future, the harder it is to really know how those interactions. And then there's always new introductions. So then the mix becomes even more unique.
Any other questions for anyone or anything
I
else?
just had one more for.
Yeah, please.
I was in Walmart this week and an end cap up at the Berlin Walmart. There was this Shaker Mountain maple syrup from Starksboro. I thought Shaftesbury originally. Starksboro. And I just wondered, like, if you're a sugar producer in Vermont, is it most likely they went to, Walmart, whether it was this one store or regionally, and said, we want to sell maple in your store, as our, family maple sugaring production, I just wondered how that works with your association.
Yeah, so I would say that is one of the other things that is really challenging right now. Access to markets it's both easier and more difficult. More difficult because there is more consolidation. In the example that you were talking about, that was a store level conversation that has translated into probably several stores within the region. Some retailers have programs that really make access to their distribution networks easy. They've put a focus on local, but for many, decision-making is concentrated with the headquarters, and the greater consolidation that exists within the retail world, the harder it is to get to decision makers. And the seat that I sit in, having time with the people that make decisions about whether our product goes on shelf or not is almost impossible. It doesn't happen easily today post-pandemic. And I think one of the takeaways is that it's a big deal for us at Butternut Mountain Farm. Maple is a big deal for us here in Vermont. For the decision maker at Walmart, thinking about what they're going to put on the shelf set, Maple syrup is a fraction of the syrup category, which is a fraction of the breakfast category that that individual is responsible for making decisions for. And while I want an hour of her time, she is less interested in that because it is such a tiny component. And so getting into bigger markets is harder and harder. And it's part of the reason, to the earlier part of conversation, so much of our business is on the private label side and not in the branded space. It's expensive on the branded space, and in the private label world, there is more responsibility on the retailer in terms of how to manage what is happening on shelf.
Any other from the presenters, any presenters, maybe not the right word, any of our guests have anything you'd like to add as closing comments?
Just say that, you know, if there are questions in the future, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to communicate and always happy to welcome visitors on behalf of the folks at Proctor. I'm sure we can have a good discussion out in the field.
I made a note too that I don't think Tim had been hired maybe a year ago, so yeah. So I think it would be helpful to have him in as well.
And that was part of the reason for the May 15th meeting, is to just have everybody in one space at a time. We tour Proctor there. It gives him an easy way to interface with a number of different stakeholders in the space as well. So definitely invite them here, and also hoping that more folks than that will be able to make it out on May 15th. It's a larger conversation about the state of the industry and also how the season went.
Representative Lipsky, did you have a final?
It's a comment relative to Allison's testimony, but for all of our, you know, we do funding for fairs and field days. And I don't know if there's public television or Vermont public television, but I saw recently a rerun of, let's call it the 90th anniversary or the 100th anniversary of the Big E. And they showed a history and what each state celebrated, whether it was a cream puff that was ethnically or locally a big deal in Rhode Island, or it went through every building and highlighted. It showed who was the first president to be like a grand marshal and the parades and all these folks from history. It is absolutely riveting. Thank you for dedicating 3 weeks of your life, 24/7, hotel rooms.
West
and-
Springfield, West.
Yeah, no, I know. I won't make any comments about what comes out of Springfield these days, but the Big E is really a great resource for New England. And when Representative Nelson brought up about feeding New England 30% of our nutrition, produce, agricultural food production by 2030 is sort of an ethos that this committee is focused on and valuing. But that whole celebration in the Avenue States is worth the trip. It's really cool. Anyway.
All right, well, we're committee, we're gonna keep meeting, so we'll say goodbye to our guests. Thank you.
And I'll leave you some syrup
Oh, thank you.
to take the edge off the first few weeks of the session. Thank you.
Fantastic.
We have 7, 8,
What I'm saying, try the other people's stuff.
Yeah, right? It's blind taste test at the
Thank you, Allison.
Is James sugaring? Is James sugaring? Is that why he's not here?
today. I am also going to leave some information on our food safety program,
Did you get it?
No.
which we have a grant program. Thanks to the staff at Senator Leahy's office, we have a federal earmark on that. So that's it's
Just maybe get some more earmarking.